Welcome back to Beginning with New Testament Greek, Chapter 6, Imperfect Indicative Verbs. In this chapter, we'll cover imperfect verbs, their meaning, morphology, and the use of the augment, as well as some irregular masculine nouns, and of course our vocab. So first off, the meaning of imperfect tense. The imperfect tense communicates an ongoing action that happened in the past. So for the present tense, we would say, I am speaking. In the imperfect tense, you would say, I was speaking. The imperfect aspect is very similar to the present. It's signifying this is a progressive action. It's an ongoing action. So luete, you are loosing. In the imperfect becomes eluete, you were loosing. Luometha, we are being loosed, becomes eluometha, we were being loosed. Just like in the present, we have a few different ways that we can translate. In the imperfect, we also have 3 different ways that the imperfect can be translated. So first is the progressive imperfect. Similar to the present progressive, the progressive action is in the past though, and many rich were putting in much money. So this is happening in the past in an ongoing manner. There's also the inceptive imperfect. This is emphasizing the beginning of an action or state. So a lot of times you'll add began or started. So he stood and began to walk. There's also the iterative imperfect, similar to the iterative present. This is conveying a repeated or customary action in the past. So with this, you might add kept on, repeatedly, continually. For an example, he solemnly testified and kept on exhorting them. So now we know a little bit about what it means. Let's talk about the morphology and our paradigms. So we start our imperfect active indicative with our stem. So for the word luo, our stem is lu. Next, we add on a connecting vowel. And just like in the rest of our paradigms, we finalize this with the personal ending. What's new for the imperfect is this augment. The augment goes on the beginning of the word and it indicates the past tense. So much like in English, we add an ed to different verbs to indicate past tense. This augment is always going to help you know that you're looking at the past tense. We will add this in the aorist as well. So altogether we have eluomen. Now let's take a look at the endings for this imperfect active indicative. We have eluon, elues, eluane, eluomen, eluete, eluon. And you notice in the singular first person and the plural third person, you have the same ending, and that is going to just be something that you can tell through context. If you encounter this word without any context, you'll need to indicate that it could be first person singular or third person plural. Also notice that the third person singular has that movable nu. And the other endings are very similar to our present tense endings. So you'll want to start memorizing these endings and being able to differentiate them from your present endings. Now let's take a look at the imperfect middle passive indicative endings. We begin again with our stem. We add on our connecting vowel, and then a new set of endings. And just like in the active, we'll add on that augment. So altogether we have eluometha. So here are the endings for the imperfect middle passive indicative. We have eluomen, eluu, elueto, eluometha, elueste, eluonto. And again, you'll notice that first and second plural endings are the same as in the present tense. So differentiating the present tense and the imperfect tense can be done by the use of the augment. So let's look at that a little bit more. The augment is a time indicator. It communicates the action is in the past. So if the verb begins with a consonant in the stem, the augment, the epsilon, is put in front of the stem. But how do you augment a word if it already begins with a vowel? If a verb begins with a vowel, the vowel is lengthened, so either to an eta or an omega. So for our alpha here on akuo, the epsilon plus the alpha becomes an eta for ekuon. In erkamai, you have the epsilon plus the epsilon becoming an eta. And then in Ophelio, you have the epsilon plus the omicron becoming an omega, Ophelion. So most imperfects are going to lengthen from an alpha or an epsilon, not an omicron. So most of the time when you see an augment, it's either going to be an epsilon or an eta. If the verb begins with a vowel and it's a diphthong, so here, alpha iota, then the iota becomes subscripted into the eta. So atuomai becomes etuomain. And so verbs beginning with eta, iota, epsilon, or omega don't usually change that beginning vowel when the augment is added. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to determine what changes are being made. So a little bit of behind the scenes here. Echo is our word, but the original stem is from sek. So it changes to econ, not ekon. So sek adds to the epsilon as the augment, but because that sigma is in between two vowels, it drops out, and then the epsilon plus epsilon becomes an epsilon iota, and so the imperfect form of echo is econ. And if you see a verb that's beginning with an eta, you can pretty much assume it's being augmented. Most of the verbs in the New Testament do not begin with an eta. You'll just want to notice in your vocab when you get a verb that already begins with eta. So let's talk about the use of u. U is a negative particle. It's used to negate a verb. So u lue is he is not loosing. So if the verb begins with a vowel and a smooth breathing mark, they're going to add a kappa to that u. So it becomes uk eluane. He was not loosing. That's just similar to the way we use a and an to differentiate particles in indefinite articles for nouns based on whether the noun begins with a vowel. The Greek uses uk because it likes to break up that vowel sound. So it is uk and u mean exactly the same thing. They're just used differently. The real important part is not that you can create these Greek phrases, but that when you see them, you know that uk and u mean that the verb is being negated. Similarly, from the kappa, if the verb begins with a vowel and a rough breathing mark, then a chi is added. So ux upago, I am not departing. And also another word in your vocab is that uhi, and that's used for stress or emphasis. So you can either add an exclamation point to a translation with uxi, or you can just add emphasis in another way. And you may have noticed in your vocab from last week that some of your nouns were masculine, and yet they ended with that eta sigma. So some nouns like mathetes and prophetes are first declension nouns that have feminine forms, except for in the nominative and genitive singular, and they are masculine in gender. Don't get tripped up by that ending. Make sure that you memorize these nouns are masculine, not feminine. Because these nouns are masculine in gender, they're going to be modified by masculine articles and adjectives, and we'll get to adjectives later. So just focus on seeing that you have tov mathetain, and that agathon is the good disciple. So ton mathetain means the disciple, and that tone is telling on the noun. So your article will never lie. Your article is telling you exactly what case it's in and the gender and number. So taking a look at your regular form, or your irregular forms, you have ha mathetes, to matheto, And that looks like a general masculine genitive singular. And from the rest of the way down, you have your same masculine articles, but feminine endings. So notice that the mathates, since that might trip you up, you might think that's a genitive construction, but it's your nominative. And a lot of times your article will help you see that is a masculine singular nominative. Whereas the genitive, since they couldn't use that eta sigma, again, they went to the traditional masculine ending for that. So notice that that genitive singular is following the masculine pattern, and everything else follows from the dative onto the accusative plural follows the regular feminine ending. If you're interested in more of these words and which ones, a full list is given in the back of your book on page 300. Now let's take a look at the vocab for this chapter. First off, we have agapao. And you'll notice that the word for love is very similar to our noun for love. Instead of agape, we have agapao. Genau, this is I give birth to, bear, beget. Genealogy might be a word that could help you with that. And then we have I ask, eperotao. Eperotao, I ask. And then another form of this, erotao, I ask, question, request. These are very similar, and if you notice it's got the same ending, the ep is a prefix in front of that. So those words are very similar. And then aiteo, I ask, demand. More verbs for this vocabulary. Akolutheo, I follow. Acolyte might help you remember that. Zeteo, I seek, look for. Kaleo, I call, invite, name. Laleo, I speak, I say. This could be helped with the word glossolalia. Martureo, I testify, bear witness. The word martyr comes from this word. Then parakaleo, I call, urge, comfort. Peripateo, I walk, live. And poeo, I do, make. Phobeo, I am afraid, fear, respect. And plero, I fill, complete, fulfill. A lot of the words in this vocabulary are going to be preparing you for contract verbs in the next chapter. So you'll see some of those words, most of the words from this chapter have vowel endings so that you will learn what happens with those next chapter.